Well, thanks everyone for coming to this IISS discussion meeting on negotiating non-proliferation with North Korea and Iran. Good to see we have a nearly full house for this interesting topic. As you know, this discussion today is part of our Shangri-La Dialogue series. We had a couple of events before the dialogue. We're having a couple afterwards to talk about issues that were on the agenda, not at the Singapore Summit necessarily, but at the IISS major defense dialogue in Singapore. North Korea was a major topic at the Shangri-La Dialogue. We want to pick up on that and, of course, on the discussions that happened a week later in Singapore at the Trump-Kim summit. We're going to do so in relation to diplomacy and non-diplomacy regarding the Iran nuclear issue. Leading off this discussion are two experts and friends who are well experienced in nuclear negotiations regarding both Iran and North Korea. One of them from the inside, who participated in negotiations with both countries, and one from the outside who watched negotiations very carefully and other aspects. So the inside man is Newell Highsmith, adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center. Until 15 months ago, he was an attorney at the State Department for 30 years with a focus on legal issues relating to arms control and non-proliferation. He was the primary legal advisor on U.S. delegations that negotiated the 1994 agreed framework with North Korea, the 2008 agreement for nuclear cooperation with India, and the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. He also was responsible for legal interpretations of numerous arms control and non-proliferation statuses and treaties, as well as various U.S. sanctions laws. Whenever I had a question in the State Department, I knew Newell had the answer. He recently co-authored an article in Survival on giving a legal analysis of the nuclear ban treaty. And that's why I wanted him to come and speak here, but we decided to change the topic to something very current, the ongoing talks with North Korea and the frequent recent non-talks with Iran. The outside woman is Barbara Slavin, director of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council and a columnist for Al Monitor, my favorite media website about the Middle East. She's the author of a great book about Iran and U.S. foreign policy and many monographs on the same subject. The book has the catchy title of Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the United States, and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. She's a frequent media commentator on NPR, PBS, and C-SPAN. And she's one of my small handful of friends who have had multiple visits to both Iran and North Korea. So we're on the record today. We have an hour. We're going to do this conversational style. The event is being recorded, and it will be posted on our website in a couple of days. Let me start off by asking both of you, maybe Newell first of all, and then Barbara, sort of a quick take on what happened at the Singapore summit.
Thank you. My reaction to the summit and to the lead up to the summit was that it was very much a mixed bag. Amazing capacity to possibly do something very positive, but then do it in a way that undercuts the positive elements of what was just being done. And to look at that, I would like to look at three aspects of it. One is the fact of the summit itself. Second, the action that was taken with respect to military exercises. And third, the statement that was issued at the end of the summit. And with respect to the fact of the summit, yes, I think the criticism is fair that a concession was given to the North Koreans without getting anything in return at that stage. I don't necessarily think that was wrong. I think given the dynamic, the saber rattling that had been going on for the past period of time, that taking a bold move to try to change that dynamic was very arguably a positive thing to do. And just as only Nixon could go to China, perhaps only Trump could go to meet with the North Korean leader without getting any concessions in return. The negative aspect of that is that the way he did it. You could have that. You could show the respect that the North Koreans crave without all the flattery, without all of the praise and the whitewashing of the regime's record, in essence, and that's where he undercut in many ways what would have been the positive aspects of taking that step to break the cycle that we had been in before that. As to the military exercises, this is not unprecedented to suspend military exercises to try to improve the atmosphere with North Korea. It was done in the 93 to 96 timeframe as well when we were negotiating the agreed framework. That part, okay, but you don't do it without consulting the South Koreans. That was unforgivable. And you don't use the language of the North Koreans in describing it, just talking about it being provocative, referring to it as war games. You're playing exactly into the North Koreans' hands in doing that. So what could have been a positive element to build up the atmosphere was undercut by, again, the way that it was handled. And finally, the joint statement. The positive of the joint statement for me, I had actually been somewhat worried that they would go in and get a very skimpy type of document, declare victory, and come home, and that would be it. So I was pleased that that they left it at a fairly general level with the concept of detailed follow-on negotiations to fill it out to fill out all the essential elements of specific steps on denuclearization, timetables, and verification above all. But again, it undercut his future negotiators to say that this is a very, very comprehensive agreement that was done when it is just the initial document to set the stage for what are going to be the important negotiations down the road. And if I were the North Korea negotiator, I would have been pretty happy with the language that emerged from it because many of the concepts that they favor are in there in terms of a gradual move towards denuclearization and pairing that with improvement of relations. So that was sort of my take on what happened. Again, some positives. We're in better shape than we were 6 months ago. And overall, I feel better now than I did when it looked like we might have a war, because a war on the peninsula, of course, would be catastrophic.
Okay, thanks very much, Newell. That's a good summary. Barbara, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think I would largely agree with that analysis. Look, the JCPOA is 158 pages long with annexes, so we will talk about comparisons between a real agreement and this piece of paper that we saw in Singapore. But I think the fact of the meeting itself was the most important thing. And this morning, for those of you who haven't seen it, you can watch on YouTube a 42-minute movie that the North Koreans have made, a documentary on the entire Kim visit, which is just extraordinary. I mean, parts of it are to the tune of the Red River Valley, as performed by a North Korean orchestra. The multiple pictures, not just of Kim and Trump shaking hands and so on and walking toward each other, but of the American flag and the North Korean flag side by side. Now, I've been to North Korea 3 times. I haven't been in a long time, but, for a country that has based its entire political philosophy on demonization of the United States, those images alone, I think, are worth everything. So it's my hope they reach a proper agreement. It's my hope that North Korea actually denuclearizes. I have my doubts that this will happen on Trump's watch. But something fundamental has shifted in the U.S. relationship with North Korea. North Korea is no longer being treated like a pariah state from the U.S. point of view, and we are no longer being treated like the great Satan, to use an Iranian term, by the North Koreans. So that in itself, I think, is positive.
That's a very good point, that we sometimes look only from our perspective of how North Korea is getting the benefit of the doubt. They're giving the United States the benefit of the doubt.
They're overturning their entire philosophy of foreign relations, really, with this meeting. So, I mean, it was a bold step, for sure. So
what are the next steps? Where do we go from here, Newell?
Well, ideally, you would have something like what we did with the JCPOA, which is very detailed negotiations of concrete steps that are going to be taken on a specific timeline. Because only then do you have that metric to measure whether the North Koreans are serious about what they're doing, about denuclearizing. I don't think it's going to be something that they're going to be giving up everything in a short period of time, but create that process by which you can measure whether they're complying as you go along, and again, most important, verification. The verification challenge is going to be greater than it was in Iran. Iran had more experience with the IAEA, including allowing additional protocol type visits, and the North Koreans have a long way to go to get that comfort level. They had some comfort level in the mid-90s where the IAEA was there in a lot of their facilities quite frequently, but they have a long way to go to get to a comfort level with inspections that, and particularly because, one, they have nuclear weapons, and two, they're going to have a lot of clandestine, presumably, facilities that perhaps nobody knows about.
Barbara, how do you see this going now in the ensuing coming weeks and months?
Yeah, absolutely. We need proper negotiations. We need, first and foremost, from the North Koreans, a declaration of what they have. I've seen all different figures. 141 sites, according to a piece in the New York Times, hundreds, according to a piece in the Washington Post today. How many sites do they have? And what's in them? How is the IAEA or U.S. inspectors or anyone supposed to verify if we don't have a baseline declaration of what they actually have? And obviously, that includes missile sites as well as plutonium production sites, uranium enrichment facilities. You name it. There have been so many complaints on the part of critics of the JCPOA that Iran somehow is still covering up things and has research going on at military facilities that haven't been inspected. So we should hold North Korea to the same or even a tighter standard, because they left the NPT in 2003 when the agreed framework collapsed, and we've had no inspectors except sporadically. I think inspectors have only been to Yongbyon and one other site in the late 90s, Cheongri, I think it was called, where there was a big kerfuffle that they had a secret site, and then inspectors went and it turned out there was nothing. But North Korea is a very mountainous country for those who've been there. There are plenty of places you can hide things.
Let me pick up on one thing here. The JCPOA was criticized because the Iranians never came clean about their previous work on nuclear weapons, which obviously they did. It was kind of swept under the rug. Now, in the case of North Korea, they can't deny that they've been proud of their nuclear weapons. But do you see them actually, declaring all the nuclear weapons and all the work that they did, and this comprehensive? I mean, the declaration in the case of the Iraq after being defeated, their full and final declaration was repeatedly revised.
Yeah.
I mean, with some of these countries, it can be a challenge for them to even know all of the things that they have. But they're also going to have an incentive. If, as most of us believe, they are going to be determined to keep their nuclear deterrent until the very last, point of an agreement, then they have an incentive not for us to know exactly how many nuclear weapons they have and exactly where they are and exactly where their stockpiles are and exactly where all their missiles are. So that's going to be a very tough negotiating point to get that declaration, maybe not so much of the facilities, but of the actual weapons, the actual stockpiles of high enriched uranium and plutonium, and the missiles themselves. So that, we presumably have some information about that of our own, but it's going to be a challenge to get them to declare that when that is their deterrent, that is their safety blanket.
Let me switch a little bit here and ask about the past. Newell, you were involved in negotiations with the North Koreans and with the Iranians as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like negotiating with these countries?
Well, they're very tough negotiators in both. Most of the ones we were dealing with are very intelligent. In both countries, they have a lack of familiarity with how the Western world works in some degrees, much less, I mean, the Iranians have much more so, but certain individuals there might not have as much as some others. For example, they think that we can make things happen in the private sector. Like, why aren't these companies coming in and investing in Iran? Why aren't these banks doing business with us? You know, why aren't you making them do that? I mean, so they have those kinds of learning curves in Iran. And in North Korea, the learning curve is, of course, much, much greater. Iranians are at least used to being out and doing, many of them, and doing business with the Western world much more than the North Koreans are. They both negotiate in a crisis and breakthrough cycle. And having gone through that with North Korea, where many, many times we thought, oh boy, today was awful, we're going to be flying home tomorrow. And then the next day, we agree on 8 things. And it's just like everybody's smiling and happy, and yesterday they were pounding the table. And we had the same experience. And having gone through that with North Korea, I was actually able to assuage some of the concerns of my colleagues with Iran, where we had some days where everybody thought we were done. I said, no, I don't think so. You know, let's wait. And I wasn't sure, but each time we got past that, and usually they came in with concessions the next day. So that's sort of their back and forth style. There's a social element with the North Koreans in terms of like drinking after, like having cocktail parties and drinking that you don't have with the Iranians. We did not share meals with them. We did not have cocktail parties with them as we did with the North Koreans. And that actually was a very interesting dynamic, because when we were doing the agreed framework, the Japanese and South Koreans couldn't be in the room. It was just us and the North Koreans. North Koreans would not sit down with them, but they could come to the cocktail parties. And so you'd see, particularly the North Korean and South Korean nuclear people would be off in the corner drinking like crazy and starting and talking back. You could tell there was an eagerness on their part to engage. And we didn't have that same dynamic with the Iranians. On the other hand, the Iranians almost all spoke fluent English. They were very easy to talk to, very friendly. And with the North Koreans, there was a little more distance vis-a-vis the Americans.
That drinking aspect, one of my best memories of London was with North Koreans and South Koreans at a dinner after an event, and then everybody breaking into arirang, except with some different verses at one point. Barbara, you have a view on this, and I want to ask you as well. Why is it easier for the United States president to hold a summit with Kim Jong-un, whereas it's almost unthinkable to have one with Khamenei?
Yeah, thanks. I wrote a piece about this for Axios yesterday. So thinking about it, you know, obviously Iranians would love to have something like this, you know, between whether it's Rouhani and Trump or Khamenei and Trump, but it ain't going to happen. And I mean, look, let's face it, so many reasons. First of all, Trump campaigned on destroying an agreement with Iran. As far as I've been able to detect, there is no plan for a new agreement with Iran. We've had a speech by Mike Pompeo with a list of 12 impossible demands. No one has been tasked with reaching out to the Iranians. In fact, we've blown up the one channel we had to talk to them, which was through the JCPOA and the Joint Commission. The focus is entirely on maximum pressure, getting the Europeans to abide by secondary sanctions. And the goal, I don't think, is a new and better agreement. The goal is to destabilize Iran. I'm profoundly sure of that. So, no, I mean, there is no interest on the U.S. side to have this kind of summit. Other reasons: Iran gave up its nuclear weapons, or its nuclear weapons potential under the JCPOA already, right? So it doesn't have nuclear weapons, and so it's not as dramatic, you know, to go and sit with them. Iran doesn't do photo-op diplomacy. And there is no equivalent to Kim Jongun in Iran. Even the supreme leader operates through establishing a consensus with other important figures in the political elite. So Rouhani is not the commander-in-chief, Khamenei is, but he would need a consensus. And finally, I mean, the Trump administration blew up the JCPOA, right? So what is the incentive? How could Iran somehow have face and come to a meeting with the man who is the destroyer-in-chief of the JCPOA? It just doesn't compute. It would be an enormous loss of face unless the United States were to somehow dramatically change its negotiating position toward Iran. So as much as the Iranian people would love to see a reprise of this in, I don't know, Istanbul or Rome or anywhere, it's not going to happen.
Barbara, let me just press you on that a little bit, though, because under the last U.S. president, who was very supportive, I mean, President Obama was engaged in diplomacy. He was in New York when Rouhani was there, and and Obama wanted to have at least a walk-by, a meeting, a run-in, arranged run-in with Rouhani. And the Iranians couldn't make it happen. Is that because they don't like photo-op diplomacy, as you put it so well, or is it because of the domestic dynamics are so much different?
Yeah, the politics, the domestic politics, where he would have been, crucified by the hardliners. Even having a telephone call between Rouhani and Obama, as you recall, caused a lot of consternation back in Iran.
I think that's a huge difference, which I meant to mention in talking about the difference in negotiating. With the North Koreans, once a decision's made,
Bingo.
That's it. And the troops can follow suit. The Iranian negotiators always had a view back to the Majlis, and the opposition in the Majlis, and to the supreme leader. So they have sort of three, and then the IRGC. So they have all these different nodes of power that they had to worry about, which was much more complicated. Not that Kim doesn't worry about other possible power centers in North Korea. He obviously did, but it's a very different situation.
So once a decision is made, then the North Korean officials will carry it out. What about the case where there seems to be a decision, but it's not written down? It was a very short statement that came out of Singapore, and both sides seem to be saying that there was a lot more discussed and a lot more agreed to. President Trump said that North Korea was destroying a missile engine test facility, and the North Korean Nodong Shimbun came out with a statement saying that Trump had agreed to a step-by-step negotiating process and agreed to lift sanctions at the end of the day. In negotiating with North Korea in particular, when things aren't written down, but there's supposed to be an understanding between the two sides, how does that work?
Not real well. I wrote the legal opinion that what they were doing in 2003 was a violation of the agreed framework. I believe it was, even though there was no explicit prohibition on enrichment in the agreed framework. But they were required to implement the North-South Denuclearization Declaration, which said no enrichment. Mm-hmm. And to me, as a lawyer, that means it's fairly clear. A, B, C. You have your answer. But I think their view is that anything that's general gives them an opening, and I think that's why they like general statements. It doesn't bother me that this, as I said earlier, that this one started off with the general statement. It doesn't bother me that it didn't include the test facilities. It was a little odd that it had the POW MIAs, but maybe that was a concession that we wanted to get, so we had something that was in our favor in that document. But I think that's a very specific thing, and those kind of specifics are, I think, to me, appropriate for later down the road. And the JCPOA and agreed framework also started off with general statements and general principles that were going to be pursued, and then you get into the details. And the question is, with North Koreans, can you get into the details? In '94, I don't think they had the capacity to negotiate something like the JCPOA. Now, they have a lot more experience now dealing with the West, and maybe they have a better capacity to do that. I have some experience with their foreign minister back when he wasn't their foreign minister. He's extremely capable in English. We would negotiate documents where his understanding of the nuance of the English language exceeded some members of our delegation.
Sounds like Javad Zarif.
Yes, actually, that's exactly right. I think their capacity to do that now is greater, and we have to test that. And that's what the follow-on has to do, test their sincerity, I'm using their term, their willingness to go forward in a detailed way. If they're not willing to do details of steps, timetables, and verification, then that's telling you something about what they really plan to do.
I remember very well the 2012 Leap Day deal and the way it was subsequently violated by a space launch. and the North Koreans saying, well, it wasn't in the deal. It wasn't written down. And the American negotiator said, we had an understanding. Everybody understood, but it wasn't written down. So why don't the North Korea, they purposely didn't write that down because they planned to do it, do you think?
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's right. And you know, in the negotiations, they'll have a lot of reasons why you don't need that. You don't need that level of detail. You have our assurance or whatever. But yeah, you better get it in writing. My experience is that if you have something very precise, very detailed in writing, they follow through on it. And if they aren't willing to put that in there, then there's probably a reason.
I think a good parallel is the way the Iranians fought over the ballistic missile language. You remember they refused to give up their right to test ballistic missiles. They insisted that, you know, in the UN resolution, it called on them, right, but it didn't require them to give up their ballistic missile testing. So they were much more careful, perhaps, about the language on that.
Barbara, I want to just one more question to you before we go to members of our audience here. The JCPOA, as you mentioned, was quite detailed. It was negotiated over 2.5 years. Can you see the negotiations with the North Koreans getting to that level of detail, that level of limits, that level of verification? And the big question, can it be better than the JCPOA? Because that's really the standard that the Trump administration has set.
Yeah, it's hard for me to envision it. I'm not sure that this administration, Trump administration, has the capacity for that sort of negotiation because of all the infighting. Frankly, you know, one thing we had with the Obama administration was a great unity of effort and purpose, and there are a lot of different currents in the Trump administration. I cannot believe that John Bolton is not going to sabotage this at some point if the North Koreans don't. I mean, he has spent so much of his career inveighing against North Korea that it'll be amazing. We'll see if his ambition trumps his principles. It's entirely possible it will. But I would watch for lurking individuals in the Trump administration trying to blow this up, as well as problems on the North Korean side. Can it be better? Well, you know, it's hard to compare in some ways because North Korea has nuclear weapons. So any agreement under which they actually gave up those weapons and came back, in particular, into the NPT, which they left, only country ever to leave the NPT, only signatory ever to leave the NPT. If they were to do that, that would be an enormous achievement. For Iran, it was in some ways easier because they didn't have weapons. And I fundamentally believe that, and maybe this is in some sense true of North Korea as well, that Iran developed this program to the extent it did because it wanted to use it as a bargaining chip to get out of pariah status and reestablish relations, certainly with the Europeans and ultimately with the United States. You know, a little easier perhaps on the Iranian side because much less of a nuclear infrastructure.
Okay, thanks.
I would just add, you know, mentioning Bolton. In his memoirs, he said when the discovery of the North Koreans' enrichment activities was the hammer he was looking for to smash the agreed framework. Yeah. And of course he cited Libya as the model for this negotiation, which he couldn't have picked a better example to scare Kim. And to me, it's not. There's two aspects. One is getting that really good, specific agreement written down. But secondly is the attitude you bring. Trump's right, it is about the attitude. It's the attitude you bring to implementation of that deal. Because if your attitude is, I'm looking for any misstep so I can, you know, beat you over the head with it, then it's not going to be a successful deal. Yeah. If your attitude is, this is a tool by which we manage the behavior of a country we have a hostile relationship with, then it can be useful. And we were using the agreed framework in that way to, and I think probably still could have when the enrichment activities were revealed. Say, no, you know, you got to come back into compliance, stop doing that, and again, manage their activities. You know that they're going to try to do things that you don't want them to do. Treat it as a management tool, not as this gotcha document.
Thanks, both of you, and thanks for speaking in sound bites that we can easly tweet. Like Trump is right; it's about the attitude. Let's get some questions. This is on the record. Gotcha. Okay, we'll go to Chris Nelson, and then we'll get as many as we can here.
Thanks so much, Chris Nelson. Nelson Report. I hate tweets.
You got to tweet,
Yeah,
Chris.
you spend the whole damn day, looking at tweets. It's worse than eBay, and less lucrative. I worry a little bit that all of us are spending more time worrying about why it's not going to work than what we need to do to make it work. But you've been talking a lot about that. That's just sort of an attitudinal question. My question is, we've all had a wonderful time making fun of the video, Trump's video. I haven't seen the one you mentioned. And after I had that fun, I started thinking, now, wait a minute, why did Trump do that? Was that simply he's showing his real estate background and that's how his mind works, so he thought it'd be a nifty, cool thing to do? Or is that evidence that some people are right, that Pompeo especially, and Pottinger probably, and others have been talking for weeks, if not months, to the Norks about what Kim's real economic development plans are and what he's really willing to trade, So maybe they know something a little bit more about what Kim has told them he will do if we do. Is there something back there that you're sort of smelling that may be behind that video? So that there's a,
Yeah.
or not. Thanks.
I don't know, the McDonald's theory of diplomacy? That's more likely than condos on a North Korean beach.
Yeah.
And, North Korea is still on the terrorism list, so I don't think the United States can do much. But from South Korea, I think clearly this is a green light for them to take all their old projects out of the closet and reinvigorate Kaesong and all these other kinds of projects. I would look to South Korea maybe for that.
But that's not what I'm asking.
Yeah, I think.
Is there something that we've been told that have convinced us that actually Kim is serious?
Let me repeat this for the record here. The question is there reason to believe that North Korea really is ready to make a deal to give up nuclear weapons in exchange for the economic development that the video that Trump showed? Because we've all been saying, we experts, that they're never going to give up nuclear weapons for any amount of trade-off. But is there something new here?
I wouldn't say never, but I don't see it anywhere in the near term. I think their vision is that they have to see a lot of benefits and a lot of change in the relationship, and maybe then, that's speculative. That's what you hope is their thinking. That's to me probably the best case is that we can start making progress on paring down their facilities. We can take these steps, and then ultimately they will give up the nuclear weapons. But I don't think there's any way to know. At least I'm not aware of how we would know that they are sincere, other than by testing it through the negotiations and then implementation.
Yeah, also, they're already getting economic benefits. The sanctions have already been loosened considerably. The Chinese will be back in there, the Russians, as well as the South Koreans. So in terms of economic development, which is so important to Kim, right? That's the other side of his government philosophy, the nukes and then the economic development. He's already getting that.
Okay. Can I get a show here? Who would like to pose a question? I want to make sure we get a good cross-section of the people here. Can I go to the woman in the third row here, please?
Thank you so much. My name is Valeria Lozova. I'm an intern for Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My question is, from your point of view, what changed the whole situation? What made us come to the actual negotiations? Because coming from the rhetoric about like nuclear button boasts and stuff like that, what from your point of view changed so dramatically? Was it economic aspect in North Korea, or was it the threats by the United States that made them?
Fundamental question. What's going on?
I think that from Kim's perspective, once he had what he viewed as a deterrent, nuclear deterrent, capable of hitting the United States, whether it can actually do that or not is another question, but he's at least demonstrated some of the capabilities, and that puts that threat out there. Once he had that, he was ready to move on to try to deal with other issues. And that's why he's willing to close down test facilities and so forth, because he feels he has that security blanket now. What prompted us to be receptive to that? I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't know. But I think he has a strategy. Kim has a strategy, and I think I have a vague understanding of his strategy. I don't have an understanding of our strategy.
Barbara's got a twinkle in her eye. I think she has an answer.
Oh, come on, this is so easy. You know, it's great TV.
Yeah.
Trump loves great TV. He wanted to do something Obama hadn't done. And, you know, nuclear weapons. I mean, how can you get more dramatic, right? So this was an easy one for him.
We've got a lot of questions. It's great that you're both giving short answers so we can get through a lot of questions. Let's go here in the front, and maybe we'll take two in a row here, first and then second row.
Thank you. My name is Sina Azuri. I work for Barbara, and I'm a PhD student in political
Your plant.
No. My supporter on Twitter.
So my question is, why would North Koreans talk to the Americans when Trump just destroyed the deal? I mean, what assurances they have? Because, you know, I've been following Iranians, and they've been saying to the North Koreans, be careful who you talk to. He may just, you know, kill the deal in a tweet. So why would they talk?
Hold on to that question, and we'll get the one in the second row here from the young man.
Yeah, so my question is actually very similar to that. There's been much rhetoric between the State Department.
Say name, please.
Oh, sorry. Omida Scary. I'm a researcher at the University of California, Berkeley. There's been a lot of dialogue in the past a few months between the State Department, Subcommittee on National Security, and others in regards to how do we define the JCPOA and how do we define this new deal with North Korea? Is it a presidential promise? Is it an executive agreement or a treaty? And based on that definition, my question is, based on the gentleman before me, how would our defining of that agreement and subsequent breach of the agreement with the JCPOA on our behalf follow through with negotiating with North Korea?
Okay, good. There's a legal question there, too. So I'm going to turn to Newell first of all.
Taking the second question first, both the agreed framework and the JCPOA were political deals. They were not legally binding on either country. They were either as executive agreements or obviously as treaties. And I think the perception in those cases, my guess is that the same will be true with whatever deal they do with North Korea in this instance. And our perception had always been that these aren't countries that are going to draw that big a distinction between legally binding and they've violated legally binding agreements. And the non-binding deals give us a certain amount of flexibility in the way that we structure it. We often have limitations on our ability to implement, and therefore, for us, we want to do it as a non-binding. However, that does mean that the next president can come in and say, okay, my predecessor made a political pledge, I rescind that, and I'm not going to follow through on that. And that's what happened with both the agreed framework and now the JCPOA. That's a problem with these kinds of complicated deals that have to be implemented over an extended period of time. It's a problem. But it would be a problem if you had it legally binding as well, because presidents can withdraw from legally binding agreements as well. So I'm not sure that fully answers your question, but the idea of a violation doesn't really have the same meaning.
I'm just going to follow up, and then we'll get to the other questions too. But when a country withdraws from a political agreement, is there any reason we should say that's a violation? Or, I mean, it's a withdrawal. I mean, if Iran withdrew from the JCPOA and decided not to fulfill its obligations, would we call it a violation?
Well, you can, if you're, I mean, it's a violation. That's not technically the right term. You are not meeting your commitments if you are remaining in the deal and not following through with what you said you do. That is different from saying, I am now out of the deal. I don't want to participate anymore. And the latter is something you could definitely do.
I mean, the violations of the JCPOA were the rhetoric that Trump used that cast uncertainty over it for the first 15 months of his presidency. That was, in my view,
while they
a
were
violation.
still in the JCPOA.
Yeah, and that was a
particularly
violation.
because the Iranians insisted on language saying that we would through our statements and actions we would support implementation of the deal, and so he obviously was not making statements that were supportive of implementation of the deal once he became president or before he became president.
Barbara.
The other question, why did they do it? North Koreans have been wanting a summit like this forever. You know, when back in 2000, when Madeleine Albright went to North Korea, to talk about a missile agreement with them. They wanted that to be the prelude to a summit where President Clinton would come to Pyongyang and finalize a missile deal with Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un. So they've been, a sign the United States accepts North Korea, no longer a pariah state, showing the legitimacy of the North Korean regime in international eyes. I think they've wanted this for a very long time, as long as it was on respectful terms, obviously.
On the very last day of the agreed framework, when we were finishing the agreed framework, we delivered a letter from President Clinton to Kim Jong-il offering certain assurances that our office had drafted very carefully. But when we handed that over, they treated it like a holy document. I mean, this was something, it was a direct communication from the President of the United States to their dear leader, and that was an enormous element. To us, it was a little bit of a throwaway, but to them, it was an enormous thing.
Well,
that respect element.
I want to get to the background of the question, though, which was that, when the United States pulled out of one nuclear deal, why would the North Koreans enter into negotiations on another nuclear deal? And maybe you've already answered it by saying, because what they get is the pageantry and the respect and the letter and so forth. Barbara, what do you think?
I don't know that they compare themselves to the Iranians. I think it gave them pause. I think it definitely gave them pause. But if they're looking for, short-term benefits, which I think they are, certainly now, namely easing of sanctions and improvement in their economy, they're going to get that. And in the long term, we'll all be dead. So I'm not sure they're really thinking that far ahead. And also, Iran is such a different look. North Korea has nuclear weapons. Iran has proxies. We are engaged in a multi-level confrontation with Iran in the Middle East. And we don't have that situation with North Korea. With North Korea, it's just their missiles and their nuclear weapons and, maybe human rights for some. But it's just they're not a player in a vital region in the same way that Iran is.
The North Koreans have a fundamental distrust of the United States. We've already pulled out of one other deal with them that was done, the agreed framework. And so they're always coming into it with a high level of distrust. And my reaction was, what we did with Iran isn't going to move that dial that much because the distrust is so deep to begin with. It's hard to make it that much deeper.
Thanks.
That's a good point.
That's another good tweet material.
Yeah.
We'll go here, gentleman there, and then we'll go to the woman in the front, the row in front of you.
Thank you, Dan Arbel. I'm at Brookings. Barbara, I wanted to ask you if you were sitting with the leadership in Tehran this morning, looking at what happened in Singapore, and then what would you actually advise them, or what do you think that they would actually be doing? Would that sort of encourage them to step on the gas and go for resuming their program, or would they actually be holding back and perhaps going to Canossa or negotiating with the administration, trying to get a new deal or something?
Pass the microphone to the row in front of you, and then we'll get two here.
Hi, my name's Harren Kim. I intern at the Global America Business Institute. I wanted to ask what kind of bipartisan cooperation needs to happen for future negotiations to create like a unified front in the United States government.
Impossible dream.
Yeah. If I can take the first one. No, look, I don't think they're going to rush for a bomb. I think there's the strategy. Chris, that's you. Yeah. The strategy.
They're called to let us know what they're going to do.
The strategy of Iran is still to try to hang in there, stick in the deal, see what the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese can come up with in the way of economic benefits, so they can justify staying in the agreement. Then they'll recalculate. I think they're also waiting to see what happens in our midterm elections and whether the Democrats take over the House of Representatives and how strong Trump is. But right now, I think as unhappy as they are and as many threats as they're going to make, they're just going to grit their teeth and try to hang on for another year or so.
But would you tell them that look, the United States can do deals with people they hate? would you try to give them some encouragement?
I would encourage them to resolve some of the regional conflicts. They're already in discussions with the European Union about Yemen, where there is a humanitarian disaster that's getting worse as we sit here because the UAE, with an American encouragement, is attacking the port of Hodeidah. I would encourage them to work on regional issues, try to get some understandings with their regional adversaries, and I would, frankly, ignore the Trump administration until the Trump administration reaches out to me, because it's Trump that has walked out of this deal, not Iran.
Okay.
No. The second question, trying to get a return to some form of bipartisan foreign policy. I don't. That's too big a question, I think, for this. But one element of this summit and hopefully a respectable deal that comes out of it is that there's because of only Nixon could go to China, only Trump could meet with Kim Jongun. There's much less chance of a future Democratic administration torpedoing this deal for political reasons than I think has been true in the past when those roles were flipped. So if you can get a respectable deal, I would feel some confident that if there's a future Democratic administration would be supportive of it and try to sustain it. And I think that is another element of possible hope in this environment.
Good. Thanks very much. There are a couple of questions here. Professor Lee, right? Yeah.
So my name is Seok-Soo Lee, visiting scholar at SAIS, Johns Hopkins. I have two questions. First one is it's not easy to find consistency and incoherence in Trump administration's foreign policy, but I'm going to try to find coherency in Trump administration. Do you think is there any relationship between cancellation, withdrawing from JCPOA on negotiation with U.S. negotiation with North Korea on nuclear disarmament? I mean, as far as I understand, the verification standard is pretty high in JCPOA. So to put pressure on North Korea, it could be he canceled JCPOA and
Okay.
That's one question. And the other one is, as far as I observe, this is a security issue. North Korean nuclear issue is a security issue, but for foreigners, it seems to be too much politicized in U.S. media. How do you think about that?
Okay, let's take those two questions, both different questions.
On the first one, Trump campaigned against the JCPOA. He was going to do this. We have to remember that there were negotiations with Congress and then with the Europeans on additional understandings that would have bolstered this agreement. I mean, there were ways to strengthen this and to build on it. He was never going to do that. I fundamentally believe he was just toying with people. And he also thought it would make him look tough to blow this up before he went and met with Kim. That's his view. I think we would be incredibly lucky to get a JCPOA-like agreement out of North Korea. I don't think we will. But that's I think, in his head to the extent, he was always determined to blow up the JCPOA. And as I mentioned, Iran is a regional adversary of much greater magnitude. The nuclear issue is almost secondary when it comes to Iran. It's more in terms of its proxies, it's Syria, it's Yemen, it's Iraq, it's Lebanon, and less the nukes, because after all, they never got to nuclear weapons.
And the second question was, is the administration treating this too much in a politicized manner, not strategic? Not both sides.
Discussion.
I mean, this is sort of like the earlier big question of bipartisanship. It's sort of bigger than it's easy to answer in a short answer. Everything nowadays just seems to get highly politicized and partisan. And I honestly don't have an answer to that. It wouldn't go on for days.
I think he actually made a good point, though, is that we commentators also have to be careful of looking at it through just political lenses. There's many other questions out here, so we want to, I'm going to get a couple here. Woman in the fourth row, and then Mike Elliman in the sixth row.
Hi, I'm Mona Mostatabi. I work at Iran Watch at the Wisconsin Project. Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
So I had a quick question. So Hossein Mousavian, who I actually find to be a very reasonable person, wrote a prescription, essentially, that was published in IRNA a couple of days ago. And one of the things he suggested to the North Koreans was not to give up their nukes. And to use it as a bargaining chip. So to me, that says that any incentive for the United States to sit down with a country is technical based, right? And so at what point, let's say, you know, I think the blocking statute with Europe and all of that, I think it's just a slow death of the JCPOA. I think it's just prolonging it. So let's say all of that collapses, the JCPOA is no longer here. What is the technical point that Iran needs to get to before we can put aside Syria and Yemen and realize this is a larger security issue? I mean, the Supreme Leader has already said he wants to enrich, he wants to move to the 190,000 SWUs, which has gotten the Europeans, like, very urgent. So, I mean, isn't this technical capacity growth, that's what's contributing to the urgency? So where do the Iranians need to get?
Well, okay. I might take that one, yeah. Mike Elliman.
Yes, thank you. I have a very short question. Is there any discussion ongoing about the chemical weapons stockpile that North Korea purportedly has, the biological weapons research that reports suggest they have, and any other security issues like the 10,000 artillery pieces that are directed at Seoul?
I think you should take both.
I don't know that. So the question is, how far does Iran need to get to be able to make the United States believe that there's a serious nuclear threat here that needs to be given top priority? And I think there may be a technical answer to that. There was the whole discussion about what the breakout time was, and if the breakout time got to within 2 months. But that, of course, was just the amount of time it would take for Iran to produce one weapon's worth of fissile material, and they'd still need to weaponize it and all. So there would still be, they wouldn't have a weapon in 2 months. But I think that breakout time discussion makes it more of a political issue than a technical one. Because if Iran were to get to that point of a 2-month or, say, a 1-month breakout period, I don't think the discussion would be, we now need to negotiate with Iran. I think the discussion would be, how quickly can the planes drop bombs on the facilities? And it wouldn't be just in Washington where that discussion were being held. And as for chemical weapons, I mean, to me, the chemical weapons would seem to be an easier get from North Korea. It's not the most demanding problem, but it seems to be the one that North Korea should be more willing to give up than the nuclear weapons, since the chemical weapons aren't the ultimate insurance policy for the regime. But I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, Newell.
No, I like your idea that it would be something that could demonstrate good faith along the way as they move towards giving up their nuclear deterrent. But I'm not aware that that's an element. I have no inside information anyway, but I'm not aware that that's an element of the discussions. I mean, what's interesting is they're approaching North Korea much the way we did with the agreed framework in the JCPOA, which is it's a nuclear problem. Yes, there's some peripheral stuff, but it's a nuclear problem and a general relationship problem. Not bringing in all those other elements like CBW and human rights and so forth, which of course was highly criticized when it was done that way in the past.
Okay, let's see how many other questions we can get in here. In the second row, the young woman, and then who?
Just has 2 fingers.
I have 2 fingers on that very last question about the conventional stuff. Just a quick reminder, I'm in the agreement, the North-South discussions theoretically get into a lot of that. We haven't talked about that at all.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Diana Myers. I'm currently a cadet at the United States Air Force Academy. I have 2 questions. How do you see Kim revising his current Pyongyang policy, and how do you see the dynamics of the USFK forces in the peninsula changing, particularly regarding to a potential revising of CONOPS? Thank you.
I'm sorry, what was the first question again?
How do you see Kim revising his Pyongyang policy?
Pyongyang policy, okay. Now, was anybody else dying to pose a question here? You don't have to be dying to pose it, but okay. All right. Well, then good. We're and then I'll just repeat what Chris Nelson had said off mic, was that the conventional balance of forces issues were part of the North-South talks and part of the Panmunjom Declaration. So I think there's probably a division of labor, that it's the United States that has the nuclear portfolio and it's South Korea that has a lot of these other issues that are of relevance. But why don't we use this answers to the last couple questions here about CONOPS, which are a little bit outside the particular issue, but we can talk about them if we want, and Byungjin, North Korea policy. We have a question about North Korea policy, a question about South Korea policy, and maybe in answering these, we can make any final points that you think we should have made along the way. Maybe, Newell, do you want to go first?
Yeah, if I could take the second one, the sort of military posture on the peninsula. As I said earlier, I don't think postponing or maybe changing the sort of the structure of military exercises necessarily is a problem, and it's been done in the past and can be conducive to improving the environment between the two countries. But I think it gets you immediately into the whole issue of how we are perceived in managing our alliances. And as I said earlier, making those changes without consulting the South Koreans and harping on the cost and so forth, using the wrong terminology to describe the military exercises can be very harmful to that alliance. And it's also sending a message to NATO and other alliances that we're doing this based on dollars, and we may not be that reliable in these alliances. So I think that was damaging, not just within the Korean context, but more broadly. Changing our general military posture there is going to require, frankly, a lot of what the North Koreans are asking for, which is step by step seeing how the progression of the implementation goes and the progression in bringing down the tension between the two sides. And I'm sure, I'm not an expert on that stuff, I'm sure there's steps you can take that would reassure the North Koreans, but not be undermining our alliance or undermining our preparedness. And those need to be looked at very carefully and worked in.
Yeah. On alliance management, I see a lot of threads that are similar on both Iran and North Korea. Leaving the JCPOA has very much damaged our alliance structure, particularly with the Europeans, who now see this primarily as a security issue. They're worried about proliferation in the Middle East, not so much as an economic issue, despite what the Trump administration has said. And with this talk of war games, not informing our allies that this is what he wants to do, Trump's constant talk about withdrawing American forces from South Korea, I see this as very, very, also neglecting human rights. I see this as very, very harmful to our alliances in East Asia. I don't think that this America First notion is a very solid policy. I think it's going to be America alone and America diminished. And I see those threads on both sides. In terms of North Korea's own strategy, this was quite clear. He was going to do his nuclear deterrent, and then he was going to focus on economic progress. And as I said, you have to watch this 42-minute documentary with him, with people taking selfies and his whole, promenade through Singapore, and they show all the glittering malls and the stores and people swimming at night in this surreal sort of looking swimming pool. It's a definite message to North Koreans that there's a better world out there. We know you know already there's a better world out there, and I'm going to try to give it to you. So that's quite a remarkable shift for a country that has emphasized, self-sacrifice and anything in order to sort of uphold the principles of these very stringent principles on Juche. Yeah, Juche. Nobody talks about Juche anymore, I guess, yeah?
I think that's a good place to end, that maybe there really is something new here that we need to pay attention to. And Chris Nelson's question, that the administration is on to something here. They're paying attention to what the North Koreans are saying. And that's another valuable outcome, I think, that's behind this whole Singapore summit. Thanks you very much for coming. The next event in our Shangri-La Dialogue series is being held on Monday in New York, if anybody would like to come, if you're going to be there. It's a reprise of the Shangri-La Dialogue, particularly focusing on the China discussion that was so prominent, and we're going to have Aaron Friedberg there to lead that part of the discussion. Please join me in thanking what I think was a great discussion here, Newell, Highsmith, and Barbara Slavin.